Hello fellow collectors, I hope you are doing wonderfully well. Today I have a discussion video for you which has been inspired by the seemingly increasing trend in recent years for directors to alter their films as they prepare for new 4K releases, sometimes in small ways and sometimes in large. This is of course a topic which has a vast history and I won't even really scratch the surface here, but I think it's something that's well worth discussing and a topic where there are various ways to look at it. Of course, the most famous instance of this is probably George Lucas with his special editions of Star Wars, which were made to coincide with the 20th anniversary of the first film releasing in 1977, where the changes he made supposedly more accurately reflecting his true vision for the films, and of course hugely contentious on release, as they continue to be to this day. More recently, we've had examples like Wong Kar-wai when he was working on his films for the amazing box set that Criterion released. He is of course an incredible and lauded Chinese director, but he also made some changes to his films, and included in the booklet he describes why, and says, "During the process of restoring many of the pictures that you are about to watch, we were caught in a dilemma between restoring them to the form in which the audience remembered them and to how I had originally envisioned them. There was so much that we could change, and I decided to take the second path, as it would represent my most vivid vision of these films. As the saying goes, no man ever steps into the same river twice, for it's not the same river, and he's not the same man. Since the beginning of this process, these words have reminded me to treat these restorations as an opportunity to present new works from a different vantage point in my career. Having arrived at the end of this process, these words still hold true. I invite the audience to join me in starting afresh, as these are not the same films, and we are no longer the same audience." And then he goes on to describe those changes, and without fully going into it, some of the things were no-brainers, such as having to slightly alter Happy Together because sadly the original film negative had been damaged and was not able to be salvaged, so something like that perfectly understandable. But then other things are not so straightforward, such as changing the colour timing for In the Mood for Love, which became a point of contention upon release. And then of course we have the most recent debacle, which is James Cameron's highly divisive 4K releases of some of his most famous films like True Lies, Aliens, Titanic and The Abyss, 3 of which never even made it to Blu-ray. Now for me, the only one of those I've seen so far is The Abyss, but in a colossally moronic move, and not the first that I've made, I might add, I accidentally just watched the Blu-ray instead of the 4K, so I have no thoughts or opinions on any of Cameron's latest releases. But that's okay, because this isn't a video about him in particular, or any director in particular, but I'd like to talk more widely about the idea of what rights an artist has over their art once it's been released. So, let's take a step outside of film for a moment and outside of my parents' basement, and let's start with hypothetical. Let's take the Mona Lisa, Leonardo da Vinci's unfinished masterpiece. A piece of art that has been in the Louvre Museum's collection since 1804, so well over 200 years. And a piece of art that has also toured the world, where millions of people have been able to see it and appreciate it. It's a piece of art that, as Indiana Jones might say, belongs in a museum. It should belong to the world, to all of us, and be available to be seen and appreciated by as many people as possible. And it has remained unaltered and unchanged and in its original state since the last brushstroke was put to it by Da Vinci. But let's say for a moment that he popped up. Again, like Indiana Jones, he'd found the Holy Grail and he'd chosen wisely and was still alive. Does he have the right to finish the Mona Lisa, perhaps at long last giving her some proper eyebrows? What if he ruined it, or decided to destroy it because it turns out he'd always hated it? Is that his right as the artist? Or has it now become something more than just his? Is it something that does indeed belong to the world, something akin to public property, so to speak? It is a piece of history. Let's change tracks a bit and take a second to think about companies making changes to classic films, changing things that might be deemed outdated or offensive so as to appease a minuscule section of modern society. How many of us would agree with that? Surely it seems like rewriting history. I think most of us would agree that a company making changes to a TV show or a film is wrong. We should never whitewash our past. How can we learn how to be better, how to progress, if we don't know what came before? And a company trying to make changes, I think, causes, rightly so, backlash. But if an artist themselves does it, it seems like there's a lot more confusion, with some decrying it as a desecration of the original, and others saying, get over it, they can do what they want with their own creation. Let's change tracks again and think about the world of music, because I'm sure most of us are well aware of remixes. I've seen many times on anniversary editions of tracks or albums where a band might put out a newly mixed and mastered release. And of course, DJs, producers remix other people's tracks all the time. Also, we have alternate versions of songs that a band or a musician might put out themselves, like an acoustic version, for example. But an integral part of this with regards to music is that the original release, I think anyway, please do correct me if I'm wrong, but the original release is usually always still available to listen to. So what you've known and heard and loved for years is still available as well as the new edition. And actually this is what has given me the idea for this video, because recently I was on Spotify listening to a band I've not heard in well over 10 years, and I saw that my favourite album of theirs had a 2013 mix. I scrolled up and down but I couldn't see the original mix of that album on Spotify, which I thought was a bit of a shame. So I went online and it took me, thankfully, all of about a minute to find that original mix. But to bring things back to the realm of film, let's compare that to Wong Kar-wai's newly colour-timed releases of some of his films, because those new editions are the only ones still being printed. And older editions of his films are actually going for a lot of money on eBay because people value the original. And unfortunately, those originals will just become harder and harder to find over time. The process now for directors getting to oversee a 4K release seems to have shifted away from just making sure the film is available in higher quality, and it's becoming more and more like that director's opportunity to revisit their film, to change things they don't like or that they think could be better. Of course, always saying that it more accurately represents their original vision for the film. But does saying that make the changes they make any more acceptable? They certainly seem to think so, which is why we hear it so often. A few months ago I picked up the 4K of Pitch Black from Arrow Video, and I had an absolute blast revisiting this film for the first time in many years. And it was before Arrow had announced their release of The Chronicles of Riddick, which is now out and available to buy in 4K. And I was curious if they were going to release that film or not, and so I started scouring the internet, and I came across a post from David Twohy, the director, talking about the restoration of Pitch Black. And he said, "Going in, I had intended to pretty much match the original vibe of the original release. But you know, once you get into it, you find yourself effing around, making a few visual departures, and some corrections too. The desire to improve your work apparently never ends, and when you get the chance, you pounce on it, even if it's 2 decades later." I thought this was a fantastic summation of what most directors probably feel when they get a chance to revisit their older films. So, I'd posit a question. If, as I'm assuming most of us would agree, that a company shouldn't be changing a film to remove or censor things, thereby essentially altering it from the original, why is the director more freely able to make changes during a restoration process? These changes, again, thereby essentially altering it from the original, and is seemingly always the case, thereby removing any chance of having that original on a higher quality format. Because whether you've had it on VHS or DVD or Blu-ray, with a new restoration comes, of course, the 4K discs, but also the new range of Blu-rays and DVDs, which will all use the new version of the film. And if you'll allow me to dive off into a slight tangent, I think with film in particular, there is also an added element at play. It's something so rare and special about film in that it's an incredibly collaborative art form. The director on their own can't make it, the actors on their own can't make it. You have sound, costumes, set design, editing, props, special effects, cinematography, and they all come together to make the final product. Surely one of the most collaborative pieces of art that can be made. I've often heard when people talk about separating the art from the artist, like with the likes of Chinatown and Roman Polanski, and people ask the question, should you buy a film directed by a criminal? And I've heard the argument that yes, you should, because it wasn't just him that made it. There were so many other people that put their time and effort and energy and artistry into making that film so successful, and by buying that film, you support them. Why should they lose out because an actor or a director has done something so terrible? And I think that's a really interesting argument. At the time, of course, the director usually has the final say, and I think they should have the final say. But does that give them the right to alter things long afterwards, and in certain ways that it might lose some of the collaboration that went into it? Let's take Star Wars as an easy example with something very small like the changing of Boba Fett's voice. Of course, in the new editions we have Tamura Morrison's voice redubbed over, but in the originals the dialogue was read by an actor called Jason Wingreen. Is it right that an actor's performance, however small, has been entirely erased? What about the set design choices and props, like the droids which have been CGI'd out in Mos Eisley? The director making these changes has now altered the collaboration that went into making the original films so successful. As I said, a bit of a tangent point, but something worth thinking about. And so, I think my personal thoughts on this would be that once a piece of art is released into the world, it is no longer just yours. And actually I'd go a step further and say that as an artist, a director, a sculptor, a painter, whatever it might be, you actually have a duty to ensure that what was released is maintained as close to the original as is possible. Once a piece of art has been released to the public, I would think it's the hope and dream of any creator that it connects to someone, that it touches them, that it means something to them. Imagine if you made a piece of art where someone came up to you and said, "This changed my life, this altered the course of what I was going to do. I met my partner through watching this or listening to this. The first time I heard your music I felt seen for the first time," or "I've watched your film and loved it every single year since I was a kid over the decades." I can't imagine being able to have such a huge impact on someone's life from something that I've created or contributed to creating. And I think that's not something to be taken lightly. However, with all that said, I don't think there's anything wrong with wanting to change something that you've made, to update it or refresh it or add something you weren't able to add at the time. But so long as the unaltered original remains accessible, I think that is the key point. Imagine if the original Star Wars trilogy was released on every box set along with the special editions. There would be about 1 million less videos on YouTube, huge fan projects wouldn't exist, as everyone would have access to exactly what they want, old or new, readily available. Indeed, more often these days with the boutique labels do we see releases that might have multiple cuts of the same film available all together, like Arrowvideo's wonderful edition of Waterworld, which had the TV cut, the director's, the theatrical, and even the Ulysses cut, the fan edit. Perfect, right? Because then you get the best of all worlds. You can see whichever version of the film you want to see. What I can't understand is altering a film and then removing access to the original. That seems like a bit of a travesty to me, and also a bit of a slap in the face to the fans who made your film or music or whatever art it was so successful in the first place. If James Cameron hates film grain, then I have no problem at all with him digitally removing it in all of his films, and then I guess he can watch them and enjoy them. But making a decision to change a film, even in a tiny way like that, unilaterally for everybody, I don't think is right when you remove people's ability to watch that film in as close to its original state as possible. Of course, during the restoration process, I'm sure due to time and financial constraints, we'll never see an original and newly altered edition made available together. It's just not feasible, but I think that is an enormous shame. And another hypothetical then, just to make my final point. Let's take the Terminator, which is shortly due to get a new release. If they did a test and released an edition where a new 4K master of the Terminator had been made with all its original qualities intact, all the grain still intact, the original mono soundtrack even, and released that alongside an edition where AI had been let loose on a master, where all the grain had been digitally removed and it was a newly remastered soundtrack, and saw how those sold side by side, I have an inkling that companies and directors would quickly get the picture as to what collectors and fans truly want to see. And if I was someone not bothered by any alterations and changes, I still think when presented with that option, I would always lean towards something as close to the original as possible because, I mean, that's the famous one, right? That's what resonated with audiences when it was first released and what made it such an enduring film in popular culture. But give people only one option and I think most would say, something is better than nothing. In conclusion, I'll again quote from Wong Kar-wai, who is himself quoting from something else. But he says, "As the saying goes, no man ever steps into the same river twice, for it's not the same river, and he's not the same man." A great saying with food for thought, but if I might humbly disagree. I've been lucky enough to see the Mona Lisa once in my life, and if I ever get the chance to see it again in the future, I can rest assured that it will remain unchanged through the passage of time. And indeed, part of the joy in seeing it again will be to see how my reaction might have changed in the intervening years. In my personal cinema journey, this is one of my favourite things, because while I am never the same man when I revisit a film, if it's one in my collection sat on my shelves, the film itself is exactly the same. And I think seeing my new reaction to it only accentuates my own personal growth and change over time. Well, that is everything from me. I hope you found the discussion and my thoughts interesting, and I hope it's given you something to mull over as well. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.